The Family Feud studio was filled with its typical energy on a bright March afternoon in 2024, the audience settling into their seats with eager anticipation for another episode of the game show that had become a staple of American television. Steve Harvey stood at center stage, his commanding presence radiating the warmth and humor that had made him one of the most beloved hosts in entertainment. The Wilson family from Seattle prepared to compete against the Garcia family from Austin, both teams displaying the excitement and competitive spirit that came with appearing on national television. Among the contestants stood Marcus Wilson, a successful young professional whose relationship with his family had become increasingly strained over differences in values and life choices. What should have been a celebration of family unity was about to become a public rupture when long-simmering tensions exploded during the game, leaving Steve Harvey stunned and forcing everyone to confront the painful reality that some family conflicts ran too deep to be set aside even for the cameras. Before we continue with what happened next, if you value stories about standing up for your principles and the courage it takes to set boundaries even when it means disappointing the people you love, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share the most powerful and thought-provoking moments from Family Feud that challenge us to think about what really matters in our relationships. Marcus Wilson was 32 years old and had spent the past decade building a life that reflected his own values and aspirations rather than the expectations that his family had always held for him. He had grown up in a conservative household where his parents Patricia and Robert Wilson had very specific ideas about how their children should live their lives. They expected Marcus and his 3 siblings to follow traditional paths, to prioritize family above all else, to maintain the religious practices and cultural values that had defined their family for generations, and to make choices that would reflect well on the family name and reputation. Marcus had tried for many years to conform to these expectations. He had attended the college his parents selected for him, studying business administration despite his passion for environmental science. He had worked for his father's commercial real estate company after graduation, dedicating himself to a career path that felt empty and meaningless, but that made his parents proud. He had dated women that his mother approved of, attending family gatherings and church functions where he played the role of dutiful son and promising young man. But as Marcus approached his 30s, he had come to realize that living according to someone else's script was slowly eroding his sense of self and his capacity for genuine happiness. 3 years earlier, Marcus had made a series of decisions that had created significant conflict with his family. He had left his father's company to take a position with an environmental nonprofit organization, accepting a substantial pay cut in exchange for work that felt meaningful and aligned with his values. His parents had been furious, viewing this choice as a rejection of the family business and a foolish abandonment of financial security. They had accused Marcus of being ungrateful for the opportunities they had provided and naive about the realities of making a living in the world. Marcus had also ended his relationship with the woman his mother had been eagerly anticipating would become her daughter-in-law. He had realized that while she was kind and accomplished, their connection was superficial and their values were misaligned in fundamental ways. He had started dating someone new, a fellow environmental advocate named Alex who shared his passion for conservation work and who challenged him intellectually and emotionally. His parents had met Alex once and had made their disapproval clear, criticizing everything from Alex's casual style to their unconventional career path. Most significantly, Marcus had begun to distance himself from the religious community that had been central to his family's identity. He had spent years questioning beliefs that he had been taught since childhood, eventually coming to the conclusion that he no longer held the same faith that his parents did. He had stopped attending church services, a decision that his mother had treated as a profound betrayal and that his father had dismissed as a phase that Marcus would eventually outgrow. The cumulative effect of these choices had been a gradual but significant estrangement between Marcus and his parents. They had continued to have contact, attending obligatory family gatherings and maintaining surface-level communication. but the warmth and closeness that had once characterized their relationship had been replaced by tension, judgment, and disappointment. Marcus's siblings had varying responses to the conflict. His older sister Emma had sided with their parents, viewing Marcus's choices as selfish and disrespectful. His younger brother Jason had been more sympathetic, admitting privately that he also struggled with some of their parents' expectations, but feeling unable to challenge them as directly as Marcus had. His youngest sister Rachel had tried to remain neutral, attempting to maintain relationships with both Marcus and their parents without taking sides in the disagreement. The Family Feud appearance had been Patricia Wilson's idea, conceived as a way to bring the family together for a shared positive experience that might help repair some of the damage that had been done to their relationships. She had entered the family in the Contestant lottery and had been thrilled when they were selected. When she informed Marcus of the opportunity, she had framed it as a chance for the family to present a united front, to show that despite their differences they were still a family that supported one another. Marcus had been hesitant, recognizing that spending several hours together in a high-pressure competitive environment was likely to surface rather than resolve their conflicts. But his sister Rachel had called him separately, pleading with him to participate for the sake of family peace. She had emphasized that their mother was getting older and that these opportunities to create positive memories together were becoming more precious. Marcus had ultimately agreed, hoping that perhaps the structured environment of a game show and the presence of cameras might keep everyone on their best behavior and allow them to simply enjoy the experience without delving into their disagreements. In the weeks leading up to the taping, the family had practiced together via video calls, reviewing common family food questions and discussing strategies. The practice sessions had been civil but not warm, with everyone maintaining careful politeness while avoiding any topics that might trigger conflict. Marcus had noticed that his mother kept making comments about how wonderful it would be to have the whole family together again, emphasizing the word together in ways that felt pointed and laden with unspoken criticism of his choices. On the morning of the taping, the family had gathered at the studio, the atmosphere tense beneath a veneer of forced enthusiasm. Patricia had fussed over everyone's appearance, making comments about how they needed to look like a respectable family on television. She had pulled Marcus aside at one point to remind him that millions of people would be watching, and that she hoped he would not do anything to embarrass the family. Marcus had felt the familiar mixture of resentment and guilt that his interactions with his mother often produced, but he had simply nodded and said that he would do his best. The game had proceeded through several rounds without major incident. The Wilson family had performed well, accumulating points and successfully answering questions that appeared on the board. There had been moments of minor tension when family members disagreed about which answers to provide, but these had been smoothed over with humor and compromise. Steve Harvey had engaged with the family warmly, making jokes and facilitating the kind of light-hearted banter that made Family Feud entertaining. Then came a question that would expose the underlying conflicts that the family had been carefully avoiding. Steve Harvey read from his card with his usual enthusiasm and energy. Name something parents want their adult children to do. It was a straightforward question designed to elicit answers about visiting more often, calling regularly, giving them grandchildren, or achieving career success. The Wilson family had control of the board, and it was Marcus's turn to provide an answer. He stepped up to the podium, and for a moment he considered giving a safe, generic response that would simply move the game along without incident. But something in the question, combined with the weeks of suppressed tension and the years of trying to meet expectations that felt suffocating, made him decide to speak a truth that he had been holding back. Marcus looked directly at Steve and gave his answer with clear deliberation. Make their own choices and live their own lives. The response was pointed and personal in a way that game show answers typically were not. Steve Harvey's eyebrows raised slightly, recognizing that there was more weight behind this answer than the question had called for. He turned to see if the answer was on the board, and while it did not appear in exactly those words, The board revealed that independence was the number 5 answer with 12 points. But the damage to family harmony had already been done. Patricia Wilson's face had flushed with anger and hurt at what she clearly perceived as a public criticism of her parenting. She turned to Marcus with an expression of betrayal and spoke loud enough for the microphones to pick up clearly. "Of course that is what you would say. Everything is always about you doing whatever you want without any consideration for your family or your responsibilities." Marcus felt something inside him finally break after years of bending to accommodate his family's disappointment. His voice when he responded was not loud, but it was firm and carried an edge of frustration that had been building for a very long time. "My responsibilities. I have spent 30 years trying to live up to your expectations, trying to be the person you wanted me to be instead of who I actually am. Maybe it is time for you to accept that I am an adult who gets to make my own decisions, even if you do not approve of them." Patricia's response was immediate and sharp, years of her own frustration spilling out in front of the cameras and the studio audience. "Your decisions have been selfish and thoughtless. You walked away from a secure career, you ended a relationship with a wonderful woman for no good reason, and you have abandoned the faith and values that your father and I worked so hard to instill in you. Do you have any idea how much pain you have caused us?" Marcus's father Robert stepped forward, his voice stern and authoritative in the way it had been throughout Marcus's childhood when he was being disciplined or corrected. "Son, this is not the time or place for this discussion. We are here to participate in a game show as a family, not to air our private disagreements in public." Marcus turned to look at his father, and something in that moment crystallized for him with painful clarity. His entire life had been about managing his parents' feelings, about keeping the peace, about suppressing his own needs and desires to avoid disappointing or upsetting them. Even now, in the middle of a public conflict that his mother had initiated, he was being told that his role was to stay quiet, to maintain appearances, to sacrifice his own truth for the sake of family image. He realized that participating in this game show had been a mistake. That coming here had been another instance of him trying to please his family by doing something he did not want to do, and that continuing to stand on this stage pretending everything was fine would be yet another betrayal of himself. Marcus made a decision that he had never made before in his 3 decades of trying to be a good son. He decided to prioritize his own dignity and emotional well-being over his family's expectations. Marcus removed the microphone from his shirt, his movements deliberate and calm despite the emotional storm he was experiencing internally. He looked at Steve Harvey and spoke with quiet courtesy. "Mr. Harvey, I apologize for disrupting your show. This was a mistake. I should not have agreed to participate." He turned to his family, his expression sad but resolved. "I love all of you, but I cannot keep doing this. I cannot keep pretending that everything is fine when it is not. I cannot keep sacrificing who I am to maintain a facade of family unity. I need to leave." His mother's voice rose with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Marcus, if you walk off this stage, if you embarrass this family on national television, you are making a choice about what matters more to you. Your pride or your family." Marcus paused, feeling the weight of that ultimatum and recognizing it as the same manipulation that had controlled much of his life. His voice when he responded was steady and clear. "Mom, I have spent years choosing you over myself, choosing family peace over my own authenticity, choosing your approval over my own happiness. Today I am choosing differently. That does not mean I do not love you. It means I also love myself enough to stop accepting conditions on that love that require me to be someone I am not." With those words, Marcus turned and walked off the stage, leaving his stunned family and a shocked Steve Harvey behind. The studio audience sat in complete silence, witnessing a moment of personal courage and family rupture that transcended typical game show drama. Steve Harvey stood frozen for several seconds, clearly processing what had just happened. He had seen families argue on his show before, had navigated countless moments of tension and disagreement with humor and wisdom. But he had never seen a contestant simply walk away from their family in the middle of a taping, choosing their own dignity over family obligation in such a direct and public way. Steve turned to the remaining Wilson family members and to the cameras, his expression serious and thoughtful. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just witnessed something very real and very painful. This was not scripted drama. This was a young man making a difficult choice to protect himself from a family dynamic that was hurting him. I do not know their full story, but what I do know is that what we just saw took courage." Steve addressed the Wilson parents directly, his tone respectful but firm. "Sir, ma'am, I understand that you are upset right now. I understand that you feel your son has embarrassed you. But I want you to think about something. He just told you that he has spent years trying to meet your expectations at the expense of his own happiness. He told you that he loves you but that he also needs to love himself. That message deserves to be heard, not dismissed." Patricia opened her mouth to respond, perhaps to defend herself or to explain why Marcus's choices had been so hurtful, but Steve raised his hand gently. "Ma'am, I am not saying you are wrong to have expectations for your children or to want certain things for them. But I am saying that your adult son has the right to make his own choices, and love that comes with conditions attached is not really unconditional love. If you love him enough to watch him walk away rather than accepting him as he is, then maybe you need to ask yourself what you are really fighting for." He turned to Marcus's siblings, who stood looking uncomfortable and uncertain. "You three have a choice to make as well. You can support your brother for having the courage to set boundaries, or you can side with your parents' disappointment. But understand that staying silent is also a choice, and it is one your brother will remember." Steve made a decision about how to proceed. "We are going to pause this taping. This family needs time to process what just happened, and forcing them to continue playing a game right now would be disrespectful to everyone involved." He looked directly at the camera. "Folks, sometimes the most important moments on television are not the entertaining ones. Sometimes they are the painful ones that remind us about the real struggles families face about expectations, acceptance, and love." The production team moved to shut down the cameras and clear the studio. Steve left the stage and went to find Marcus, who was sitting alone in a side room with his head in his hands, processing the enormous step he had just taken and the likely consequences it would bring. Steve knocked gently on the door and entered when Marcus looked up. He sat down beside the young man and spoke with the wisdom of someone who had navigated his own complex family relationships. "I do not know if what you just did was right or wrong. That is not for me to judge. But what I do know is that it was authentic. You reached a point where you could not keep pretending, and you chose to be honest even though it cost you something. That takes strength." Marcus's voice was shaky when he responded, filled with a mixture of relief and grief. "I feel like I just blew up my family. I know they are angry and hurt. I know this will make everything worse between us. But I could not stay there and keep accepting being treated like my choices are failures and like who I am is disappointing." Steve nodded with understanding. "Son, let me tell you something I have learned. You cannot control how other people respond to your boundaries. You can only control whether you set them. Your parents may come around eventually and learn to accept you as you are, or they may not. Your siblings may support you, or they may side with your parents. But the one thing you can control is whether you continue to sacrifice yourself for their comfort." He continued, his voice filled with compassion. "Walking away today does not mean you do not love your family. It means you are refusing to accept a version of love that requires you to be someone you are not. That is healthy, even though it is painful. Give yourself permission to grieve what you have lost, but do not let anyone make you feel guilty for choosing yourself." The conversation continued for some time, with Steve offering perspective and support while Marcus processed his emotions and his fears about what would happen next. Eventually, Marcus agreed to participate in a follow-up conversation that Steve wanted to have on his talk show about family expectations, adult children's autonomy, and the difficult choices people sometimes had to make when family relationships became unhealthy or conditional. The immediate aftermath of that March day was difficult for Marcus. His parents were furious about what they viewed as a public humiliation and a deliberate rejection of family. They sent him messages expressing their anger and disappointment, reiterating all the ways they felt he had failed them and warning him that if he wanted to be part of the family, he needed to apologize and demonstrate that he understood how wrong his choices had been. His older sister Emma had also contacted him, echoing their parents' sentiments and suggesting that his behavior had been selfish and dramatic. But Marcus also received unexpected support. His younger brother Jason had called him privately to say that he had been brave, and that Jason admired him for finally standing up for himself even though it meant facing their parents' anger. His sister Rachel had come to visit him, acknowledging that while she wished the conflict could have been handled differently, she understood why Marcus had reached a breaking point. She admitted that she also struggled with their parents' expectations and that watching Marcus set boundaries had made her think about her own relationship with the family. Marcus had also heard from extended family members and old friends who had seen what happened or heard about it. Many of them had reached out to express support, some sharing their own stories of difficult family dynamics and the challenges of setting boundaries with parents who had different values or expectations. Several people told Marcus that watching him walk away had given them courage to address their own family issues that they had been avoiding. Marcus worked with a therapist to process the complex emotions that came with choosing himself over his family's approval. He experienced grief for the relationship with his parents that he had hoped for but likely would never have. He felt guilt about the pain his choice had caused even though he believed it had been necessary. He worked through anger about years of feeling controlled and judged. He also experienced relief and liberation from no longer trying to contort himself into a shape that would earn his parents' acceptance. 3 months after that March day, Marcus appeared on Steve Harvey's talk show for a follow-up conversation about what had happened and what he had learned since then. He appeared composed and at peace in a way that suggested he had done significant internal work since the Family Feud incident. When Steve asked him how he was doing and whether he had any regrets about walking off the stage, Marcus's response was thoughtful and honest. He explained that he did not regret his decision to leave because staying would have required him to continue accepting treatment that was damaging to his mental health and self-respect. He acknowledged that the public nature of the conflict had been unfortunate and that he wished his family could have addressed their issues in private. However, he recognized that the tension had been building for years and that at some point something had to give. He noted that if the breaking point had not happened at Family Feud, it likely would have happened somewhere else eventually. Steve asked Marcus about his relationship with his family in the months since the incident. Marcus explained that his parents had continued to maintain that he owed them an apology and that until he acknowledged his mistakes and changed his ways, they were not interested in having a relationship with him. He found this painful but also clarifying, as it confirmed that their love had always been conditional on his compliance with their expectations rather than based on genuine acceptance of who he was. His relationship with his siblings had evolved in different directions. His older sister Emma remained aligned with their parents and had essentially cut off contact with Marcus. His younger brother Jason had become closer to Marcus, the two of them bonding over shared experiences of parental pressure and supporting each other in setting healthier boundaries. His sister Rachel maintained relationships with both Marcus and their parents, but had become more willing to push back against their judgments and to advocate for Marcus when their parents criticized him. Marcus had also grown closer to his partner Alex, who had supported him through the difficult aftermath and who had encouraged him to stay true to himself despite the cost. Steve asked Marcus what he would want to say to other people who were struggling with family expectations that felt suffocating or who were trying to figure out how to be authentic while maintaining family relationships. Marcus looked directly at the camera and spoke from hard-won experience. He explained that people could not control how their families responded to their choices, but that they could control whether they made choices that honored their own values and needs. He acknowledged that setting boundaries with family was difficult and often came with consequences including potential estrangement, but that the alternative of living inauthentically to maintain relationships based on false versions of yourself was ultimately more damaging. He emphasized that choosing yourself was not selfish, but rather a necessary act of self-preservation and self-respect. Marcus also addressed the complexity of guilt that many people felt when disappointing their parents or family members. He explained that guilt was a normal response to breaking away from family expectations, but that it did not mean the boundary setting was wrong. He distinguished between healthy guilt that prompted people to make amends when they had genuinely wronged someone and unhealthy guilt that was manipulated by others to maintain control. He encouraged people to examine whose voice the guilt represented and whether it was based on reasonable expectations or on others' unwillingness to accept their autonomy. Steve brought expert guests into the conversation, including a family therapist and a psychologist who specialized in adult children and parent relationships. They provided context about the challenges many people faced when trying to individuate from families with rigid expectations. They discussed the concept of conditional versus unconditional love and how conditional acceptance often masqueraded as concern or high standards. They talked about the importance of adult children having the right to make their own choices, even when those choices differed from what their parents wanted, and about the grief that came with accepting that some family relationships could not be salvaged without sacrificing one's authentic self. The experts also addressed the parents' perspective with empathy while maintaining clear boundaries about appropriate parental behavior. They acknowledged that parents often had genuine concern for their children and wanted what they believed was best for them. However, they emphasized that once children became adults, the parental role needed to shift from directing to supporting, from controlling to accepting. They explained that parents who could not make that shift often ended up losing their children either to complete estrangement or to shallow relationships based on surface-level interaction rather than genuine connection. The response to Marcus's appearance was significant and divided. Many viewers expressed strong support for his decision to walk away and to prioritize his own well-being over his family's approval. They shared their own stories of difficult family dynamics and the courage it took to set boundaries. They praised Marcus for modeling what it looked like to choose authenticity even when it cost relationships. However, some viewers criticized Marcus, suggesting that he had been disrespectful to his parents and that family should be prioritized even when there were disagreements. They argued that he should have handled the conflict privately rather than walking off on national television. Some suggested that he was being selfish and that compromise was necessary in family relationships. The conversation in online communities and social media revealed how common these family dynamics were and how many people struggled with similar issues around expectations, acceptance, and the right to make autonomous choices as adults. 1 year after that March day, Marcus had built a life that reflected his values and choices. He had continued his work with the environmental nonprofit, finding deep satisfaction in advocacy that aligned with his principles. He had moved in with Alex, their relationship deepening as he became more fully himself rather than a version edited for parental approval. He had maintained close relationships with his siblings Jason and Rachel, though their interactions were complicated by the divided family dynamics. He had largely accepted that his relationship with his parents might remain fractured indefinitely, grieving that loss while also recognizing that he could not sacrifice his own well-being to maintain a relationship that required him to be someone he was not. His parents had not softened their position. They maintained that Marcus owed them an apology and needed to demonstrate through changed behavior that he respected their values and their role in his life. They spoke about him with sadness and disappointment to other family members and friends, positioning themselves as parents who had done everything right, but whose son had inexplicably rejected them and their values. They seemed unable or unwilling to examine their own role in the estrangement or to consider that their conditional acceptance might have contributed to Marcus's decision to distance himself. Steve Harvey occasionally reflected on that March day in his later work and interviews. He said it remained one of the most memorable moments in his hosting career because it represented such raw authenticity and courage. He talked about how Marcus's decision to walk away had challenged his own thinking about family loyalty and obligation, prompting him to examine the difference between supporting family and enabling unhealthy family dynamics. He emphasized that while family relationships were important, they should not require people to fundamentally betray themselves. The legacy of that day at Family Feud extended into broader conversations about adult children's relationships with their parents, the concept of conditional versus unconditional love, and the difficult choices people faced when family expectations conflicted with personal authenticity. Family therapists reported that many clients referenced Marcus's story when discussing their own struggles with parental expectations. The story became a reference point for conversations about healthy boundaries, emotional manipulation disguised as concern, and the courage required to choose oneself, even when it meant disappointing people you loved. Before we conclude this thought-provoking story, if you believe that people deserve to be accepted for who they are rather than who others want them to be, and that choosing authenticity over approval is an act of courage rather than selfishness, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share stories that challenge us to think deeply about our relationships and the values that guide our choices. Years after that March day, Marcus reflected on the decision he had made to walk off the Family Feud stage and the consequences that had followed. He acknowledged that the estrangement from his parents remained painful and that he still hoped they might eventually accept him as he was. However, he did not regret his choice because it had allowed him to stop living a double life and to build relationships based on honesty rather than performance. He had learned that disappointing people was sometimes necessary for personal integrity, and that love that required him to betray himself was not truly love at all. The story of what happened when Steve Harvey was stunned by a contestant walking off after a dispute with their family became a powerful example of the difficult choices people faced when trying to balance family loyalty with personal authenticity. It demonstrated that not all family conflicts could be resolved, that sometimes the healthiest choice was to create distance rather than continuing to engage in dynamics that were damaging, and that choosing yourself did not mean you did not love your family, but rather that you also loved yourself enough to insist on respect and acceptance. Marcus's journey from dutiful son, trying to meet impossible expectations, to an adult who set boundaries and prioritized his own well-being served as both a cautionary tale about the costs of conditional love and an inspiring example of the liberation that came from choosing authenticity. His message remained consistent over the years, which was that everyone deserved to be loved for who they actually were rather than for who others wanted them to be, that adult children had the right to make their own choices, even when those choices disappointed their parents, and that walking away from relationships that required self-betrayal was not giving up but rather an act of self-respect and courage. That is the true story of what happened when a Family Feud contestant stunned Steve Harvey by walking off the stage after a family dispute, reminding us all that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose ourselves, even when it costs us the approval of the people we love most, and that authentic relationships built on genuine acceptance are worth more than false harmony built on performance and pretense.